Space communications. These will be among the main topics for dialogue.
How do we transform food waste into a resource and use different kind of what would be considered waste, organic materials, into kind of new materials for the future?
LinYee, how are you?
Great, Dan. How are you?
Very well, thank you. So you're in New York, yeah?
That's right. I'm in Crown Heights, Brooklyn. It's night for us. It's day for you guys. You have great sunlight. But yeah, we're doing great. I can't believe it's almost the first day of October, full moon.
Time is flying at the moment. It's crazy.
What is time?
Exactly. So LinYee, we're huge fans of mold here in Bali. We have it in the hotel, and it's a big favorite of ours. For anybody who doesn't know what mold is, just give us some insights, and also what led you into creating this extremely interesting body of work.
Well, thanks so much for your kind words. Mold is an editorial platform about design and the future of food. I am a design journalist and a design editor. I've been working in this space for over a decade now. And when I was editing an industrial design website called Core 77, I started noticing these really interesting food and design projects that were popping up, primarily from students. So, it was students reimagining food storage, for example. Like, what would food storage look like if we stopped using refrigerators? There were students who were really thinking a lot about materials. How do we transform food waste into a resource and use different kind of what would be considered waste, organic materials, into kind of new materials for the future? And I was really inspired by these projects. And at the time, this was like 2012, there really weren't any editorial platforms that were covering this type of design. Design at that point was still pretty relegated to furniture and lighting, interior objects. And I just have a kind of lifelong passion for food. And so I thought, well, who better to explore this terrain than me? I love design. I love design. I love food. These are two of my passions, and to see these kind of intersect in these very interesting, thoughtful projects was really inspiring for me. So I launched Mold as kind of like a night and weekends project. And a couple of years later, I realized that just doing these kind of short stories online wasn't really enough to have a good understanding of the potential for food and design. And so I thought, well, what better way to reach designers than to create a design object? And as a person who loves magazines, who has always collected magazines, who's always been really invested in the kind of world of magazines, I thought I would create a magazine that could help people have a better understanding of the different facets of food design and how that kind of lens could help us think about ways that designers could offer solutions for the coming food crisis. For those of you who may not know this is something I didn't even know until just a couple of years ago. The United Nations predicted that by the year 2030, which is literally just a decade away, we won't be able to produce enough food to feed the 10 billion people that will populate the planet. And if this is not like a food crisis, if this is not a food emergency, I don't know what is. And I feel like designers with their professional training to think in this very interdisciplinary way to offer scalable solutions that really take into account, the real questions at hand. Designers are trained to ask questions and to formulate questions. They really have a particular skill set that could offer really interesting solutions for the coming food crisis.
And talking of crisis, we're in a huge crisis right now. We're in a global pandemic, and it's quite clear looking at some of the systems, within industrial agriculture, globalization, things just clearly are not working. They're not working now, and certainly, as you're mentioning, in the next 10 years, it's going to be even worse. I do feel, this does offer us a chance to really reflect and implement, new systems, some positive changes, because, social level of social, environmental, nutritional level, things just clearly are not working. And I was quite interested in your hyper-localized philosophy you were calling it. Can you just explain exactly what that is and how that would work?
Yeah, I think as I've done this work, as I've done this research, as I've talked to experts in the field, I've come to the conclusion that what designers should be working towards is creating systems, tools, products that allow individuals to knit together hyper-local food ecologies. What that means is that for us, like for example, I mentioned that I'm in Crown Heights, Brooklyn. We're a neighborhood. There's kind of questionable geographic boundaries for that neighborhood, but we are in a place that services a huge number of people. And I believe that we are in a kind of technological, a social kind of moment where we should be able to produce a substantial amount of food in order to feed people locally, food that is nutritious, that is culturally appropriate, and that is produced relatively locally. Does that mean that we're all going to be kind of growing things on our rooftops, in our backyards, in our front yards? Potentially. But, I also think that there are many opportunities for urban centers like New York to have relationships with peri-urban centers that are almost like immediately outside of our city boundaries, where we can have a reciprocal relationship where, for example, just like an hour and a half upstate New York is one of the most fertile pieces of land in the United States, in the Hudson Valley. And we as concerned citizens, as people who are creative problem solvers in a very kind of precarious world, need to be able to forge local relationships with producers, with technologists, with scientists who can help us create these networks, these systems where we can have a sense of food sovereignty. For example, you guys are in Bali, and I don't know how much food is imported into Bali, but I can imagine a huge percentage of the food that is consumed, especially in the hospitality industry, is probably imported from elsewhere. And to your point, during the pandemic, these cracks in the kind of globalized food distribution chain were really, really obvious. I mean, on a small scale, I ship magazines from New York to other places around the world. And just something as small as a magazine, there's problems, huge delays in shipping those things. Now imagine food at scale. There's things like refrigeration to consider. Obviously, most food is very perishable. These kind of getting our food from far off places just doesn't make sense anymore. We need to create a culture where our diet really celebrates local ingredients, seasonal ingredients, not just because they are more nutritious and they taste better, but because it's critical to a kind of robust food future.
Yeah, well, we're in Bali, and Bali by nature, it's an agricultural island. People have been growing rice here, and just by default have been living very self-sustainably, probably until, the last 30 or 40 years. And what we're seeing now in the pandemic, it's kind of really as you mentioned, brought these cracks to the surface, and it's really sort of made us again realize the fragility of what it means to be human, and on a level of survival and looking after ourselves and being self-sustainable. And we are seeing now a lot of people going back to the lands, kind of starting the farms again, and there's definitely a move back towards that. But the issue obviously in modern times is there enough land? Is there enough to feed the growing population? These are all the sort of questions that I think we need to sort of look at deeper and think, how could we move towards being a lot more self-sustainable in the modern world. And I guess, on a personal level, I've actually started growing my own at home recently during this pandemic, and it's really kind of, as you mentioned, food sovereignty. It's really kind of given me just a really nice feeling, and it kind of the seeing it grow, feeling the kind of nutrition going through your body, and just having that connection with your food. It's something which I feel a lot of people are looking towards. How easy is it for people, in New York who are living in maybe small apartments that don't have a garden? How easy is it to actually grow in that type of environment? Is that possible, or how could people start to look into that?
Now, I don't think that it's maybe technically possible for people living in a New York apartment to grow all the food that they consume. Like, I don't think that there's just not space enough for grains, for example. We can grow tomatoes for the season, and I'm lucky enough that I have a backyard space that I can access. But what I do think is really important, and to your point, is to start cultivating a relationship with our food. Now, that can mean a lot of different things, and I think that one of the things that I think is the most kind of valuable lesson that we can learn from something as simple as growing herbs, or trying your hand at beans, or if you have a little bit of outdoor space, like doing something like a tomato plant in a pot. What these things but doing all these things teach us is practices of care, and how the very simple act of caring for something else consistently, whether that's just, kind of checking in, watering, making sure there's no pests. These types of acts of care are really critical for us to have a relationship with food, and cultivate a sense of respect for where food comes from. And I think that that's actually a much more interesting baseline to start out with, especially from a lens of design. Like, how can we design interior spaces, products, systems that really encourage acts of care as a kind of relationship building experience. Like you mentioned, that Bali for probably the last thousands of years has been food sovereign. It's, people have really been able to cultivate enough food on the island for themselves, and I'm sure that has a lot to do with the biodiversity of the island, the biodiversity of what they eat, as well as this kind of understanding that we have a relationship with our environment that is beyond an extractive relationship. So when we do take care of something like a plant, so you have a plant, I have some plants, some people might think I'm a little bit of a crazy plant lady, but taking care of these things really allows us to understand that there is so much more that our spaces, our non-human companions have to offer us beyond just give me fruit, give me food. What can you give me? I am actually get so much from just taking care of my houseplants. What else can we kind of cultivate, not just for food, but for kind of relationship building, for understanding more of who we are as being human?
It's that connection to nature, isn't it? And that kind of, even if you don't realize it's that subconscious draw of needing a plant or needing something living to actually sort of bring back that essence of we are part of nature, we're all part of the same system.
Yeah, I mean, people who like pickle, for example, ferment, kombucha, sourdough, you know, like lacto fermented vegetables. That's a kind of caretaking as well. And it's a really delicious kind of caretaking. And so, again, I don't necessarily know if people in a place like New York City, in like their small apartments, will ever be at a place where they can grow everything that they eat. But I don't think that that should stop us from starting with something small, which means that we just take care of something and it in turn takes care of us and gives us something delicious. Like that seems like a great trade-off, you know?
That's the laws of nature. So you sort of give to
That's
receive
right.
and vice versa. Yeah, and I guess if enough people on a micro level, one pot, grow a few herbs, enough people do that in the neighborhood, it raises that level of consciousness and people start getting into it. Then, as you mentioned, talking about care, respect, and ultimately community and how that local community then come together and then look at designers, look at creative people and say, okay, how can we hyper localize this, but make it a bit more sustainable, that there's more than just one pot. And I guess that's when things such as vertical farming and converting maybe desolate areas of the neighborhood into growing lands. And yeah, I guess that level of community is something which we would probably need to look at again, which is very strong here in Bali, but maybe not so much in the urban areas anymore.
Yeah, nature is always so abundant. There's like very rare do we grow something and it just gives us enough for us. Like it almost always provides an abundance of fruit, of vegetables, of seed for the next generation, for sharing. It's always kind of that's the kind of DNA of nature. And we as humans have been taught, especially within the system that we live right now, that we live in a scarcity system, which is nature has shown us that that's actually not true. And so, one of the things that one of the contributing writers for Mold recently wrote about is how Cologne in Germany recently passed laws to move the city towards what they call an edible city. And I think that these types of political, or I would say citywide, city level efforts to create systems, networks, policy that encourage people to think about their environments, whether it's rural or city or somewhere in between, as opportunities to create environments that will be nurturing for both people and plants and microbes and other sorts of delicious collaborators. I think that that's a huge, huge shift in mindset and something that designers absolutely are invested and involved with. I mean, imagine city planners of the future, instead of like thinking about traffic flows, although people should definitely think about traffic flows, they think about air quality. How can the materials that we're building in actually cultivate a microbiome that will then be conducive to, algae that we can then like harvest for nutrients. These are things that, again, are ecologies, that are systems. It's not like, you put one thing in, one thing comes out. It's like, any gardener knows that it's actually about creating ideal conditions for the right things to thrive.
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, I hope after this pandemic we are a bit more aware of these things, and it does lead on to a bit of a movement. I'm definitely seeing it here in Bali, and I hope that happens in the urban areas as well. So fingers crossed. And also you mentioned about the current population growth, and it's completely unsustainable in the current climate of how things are. And even in today's world, I think there's around 1 billion people that don't have access to food. You mentioned food waste as well. How do you see us changing our relationship to food waste? Because nature there's nothing in nature is wasted, but us humans, we waste everything. And we have a culture of just single use, throw it away, discard it, go on to the next thing. And it's clearly killing the planet, it's killing ourselves, it's not good for anything. How can we sort of change our relationship to food waste in terms of maybe helping towards feeding people or at least not putting it into landfills and going into the oceans and these types of things? What could be done, do you think, on a level of relooking at food waste?
Well, I think you kind of already answered the question, which is like, thinking about the world and the system that we live in as a living ecology is the first thing. So the idea of throwing something away is not a real thing anymore because it doesn't go away. We are still living with it, even if we're not seeing it, right? So just shifting our mindset into an ecological perspective, I think, is, first of all, extremely critical. But secondly, why think about something as waste? It's kind of going back to the gardening metaphor. Like a weed is something that is just a plant that's out of place, right? So if we are thinking about waste, specifically food waste is just organic material that is out of place. We have, a terrible expectation around kind of uniformity in, for example, the produce that we buy, uniformity in the diversity of things that we eat. It's kind of ingrained in us. Like I saw a little kind of image the other day on social media that was like, why do babies not like fruit but love Cheerios or whatever? And it was because they were like, sometimes apples taste sour, sometimes they taste sweet, sometimes they're soft, sometimes they're crunchy. They're like really, there's just no uniformity in it, whereas Cheerios taste the same every time. And so there's something kind of ingrained in us that really wants consistency. But luckily we grow out of that stage and we learn to love a diversity of flavors, a diversity of textures. I think that those things are quite cultural. And so by embracing a kind of diverse palette, by embracing an aesthetic of biodiversity, I think that that's another way of us shifting our relationship with food. And then finally, I think it's just really about having a different kind of relationship with our food, of seeing food as something that's valuable. Going back to the design of cities, in our food waste issue, which we had a whole issue dedicated to questions around food waste. We had an architectural anthropologist write about the ways that architects and city planners can actually change our relationship with food waste. So instead of like an American model where you go to the grocery store and you buy in bulk, once or twice, once a week or twice a month or whatever, why can't we shift that where there's opportunities like small markets, places that have experts on different kinds of food that will allow people to shop at a smaller scale on a more regular basis so that they're not throwing out so much food at the end of the week, that they're not like, oh, there's this thing in the back of my fridge, I don't know what that is, but it's like totally not edible anymore. Like, why can't we just have a more walkable, livable, relatable relationship with our food purveyors, and this goes back to this kind of hyper-local ecology. Let's spend money with people who we know, like your butcher's going to tell you this cut of meat is really fresh today. Maybe you can cook it this way tonight. It's going to be delicious. This is where this meat comes from. I just think even just having that as an option in cities is something that is becoming less and less accessible. And so I hope that urban planners, designers can really think about how do we create more touch points with food and people who are food experts?
That's very interesting. I think we definitely have on a mainstream level been separated from our food. That connection just seems to have been lost. And a lot of that, I think, is, the giant supermarkets and, as we mentioned, the globalization of things. One of my first jobs when I was actually 15 was in the supermarket. And at the end of the night, it was my job. I was the guy that had to go and take all of the trolleys. I mean, you're talking dozens of trolleys of waste product, which isn't actually yet out of date. It goes out of date the evening after, and I'm sure it's fine to eat for a few days after. And you'd think, okay, well, maybe they can give that away to the local homeless charities, but no, it has to be destroyed. And I was the kid that had to throw it into the shredder, and it's just food waste mixed with plastic, just everything went in there. And then I assume that just got landfilled or whatever. It's pretty disgusting. And, at 15 years old, I just couldn't believe I was doing it. I was like, wow, this is just wrong. And I feel, that giant corporations who are they're almost deliberately trying to keep us separated. So everything's prepackaged, it's just about consuming and everything is like super accessible. So I think definitely you're right, building that local connection where you feel a real kind of relationship with the person who's growing it, with or just with the food itself. It's definitely interesting. And on the subject of the plastic waste that much of our food comes in, right now during the lockdown we've seen a lot of online shopping, a rise of online shopping, home deliveries, all these types of things, and that's actually caused a big spike in packaging waste, and that's a big problem. And have you seen much, and I know you've mentioned it a bit in your magazine, in terms of designers offering solutions on how we can overcome these issues of plastic waste? Have you seen anything out there that could potentially offer a solution?
Absolutely. I think that we forget that plastic is actually a new material, that it's something that we've only recently have a relationship with plastic, and it's just that all of a sudden everything is made out of plastic or oil. And I don't think that it's too far outside of our kind of reach at this moment to move beyond plastic. There's so many incredible material designers out there who are researching, not just biodegradable, but like natural materials that could be fit for purpose for single use. I mean, I think that there are certain things that come in plastic that, I'm not saying that we don't always need to have plastic, but I think that there's certain things that, like, if you have a plastic bowl that you used for 30 years, like, it's kind of there's a certain kind of life that expectancy around it. If you have a cartel chair that is in your family for 60 years, then that's something. I mean, plastic lasts forever, so I'm not saying I'm pro plastic, but I think specifically within the scope of food, so much of the plastic that's used is used in single use kind of context, which makes no sense whatsoever. And so I think that the challenge is not just thinking about new materials that could replace plastics, but also designing new rituals around eating where we can kind of reimagine some of the most delicious things that we eat and cook with and prepare and serve with, using materials that are meant to be used once and then can be composted in your home composter, that can then be just, not tossed, but returned to the cycle. And I think that, like, for example, in Asian cuisine, there's so many kind of delicious things that are wrapped in leaves, that are served in a way that is kind of meant to be just eaten on the street, like in kind of plant-based materials. And I think that that's something that just to think about moving back towards those types of rituals and eating experiences is not a bad idea. I mean, you're drinking out of a coconut, right?
Yes, exactly. Got my coconut here. Yeah, I mean, I'm very fortunate to be in Bali, where we still are connected with what's around us, with nature. I mean, it is slowly changing, but credit to the Balinese, they've really held on to their traditions very strongly. It's a culture unlike anywhere else in the world. And yes, everything by default is sustainable because they're growing everything, and then the waste is used as packaging, and then at the end of the night they're literally just discarding it into the river. But because it's just a natural material, it doesn't matter, you know. But what the issue is, since plastic has invaded the island, I think it was the 80s when really it started kicking off. There was no real education that came with that. So the locals, you know, had no idea that this was a bad material. So they were replacing what was formerly banana leaf, or in some cases, kind of like a woven type of natural material, with the plastic, and then discarding it at the end of the day into the river or down into the gutter, not understanding that that was bad. And I think now things are starting to change and people are starting to become aware of that. But it is so efficient using the leaves and those types of things. It works so well.
Yeah, I mean, I would say globally, it's not just with local people in Bali. It's like all over the world, people still don't really like comprehend that when you throw a piece of plastic away, it actually is going to be there for the next 1,000 years. It's like, I mean, I have a young son, and I mean, just diapers. Like, I don't even want to talk about it. It just makes me just so angry. But thinking about how many diapers people, like babies, use in a week, times whatever, how long babies are in diapers, like it's just insane. Like plastic is just, it's not, there's a kind of culture around convenience when it comes to food, when it comes to our lifestyles. And I like what you mentioned about kind of traditional methods of, you know, packaging, and some of that's knowledge. That's a kind of indigenous knowledge that usually is passed down generation to generation. It's about understanding that a plant can be used in all these different ways, using tools, technology, again, knowledge to transform those things. And I think that the problem isn't just about re-embracing like a banana leaf as a form of packaging, but it's also about reclaiming those types of knowledge pathways within the culture, and really asking people like, oh, tell me about how this is made. Let me, like, explain to me your process, because I want to, you know, investigate that. I want to invest in that. I want to reclaim that as part of, you know, the culture of this space, of these, of could it be could we export this knowledge into like a globalized culture? And I think that those are things that it's not just the material, but it's also the knowledge that comes with those materials.
Absolutely, yeah. There's a lot of wisdom there, which sadly we're losing. Last week or a couple of weeks ago on the show, we had Julia Watson. She's also in New York. I don't know if you've seen her book, Low Tech. She's incredible. And she touched on exactly that. She's amazing, yeah. She touched on exactly that. We've got all of these ancient wisdoms, indigenous cultures that have been practicing this for thousands of years. And right now we've kind of lost that, or we're losing that. And definitely there's a lot of answers to some of today's problems. We just need to look back, and, you know, we can maybe use technology and modify it for today's world. But certainly all of the answers lie there, but by and large we're either losing it or ignoring it. And a lot of that is down to the current system of, whether that's capitalism or the way that things are run, you know, profit-led. It doesn't always sort of work in the way that we'd like to. But I think you're right. There's those ancient indigenous systems, a lot of the answers kind of lie there. It's just how do we look back on a mainstream scale and really kind of bring it in today's world.
But it's, you know, it's not a backwards looking kind of practice. It's actually a future looking practice. I mean, when you think about it, this knowledge is something that has been within specific cultures for thousands of years. And we need that knowledge in this moment more than ever. And so it's not like, oh, I'm going to investigate this like primitive thing. It's actually like, no, please bring this indigenous technology that you have known for thousands of years, that we have tried to stamp out, and save what we can for our future generations. You know, there's speaking of kind of the world burning, like, you know, obviously right now on the west coast of the United States, there's insane fires, forest fires. And what we understand is that the stewards of the land, the indigenous people who had lived there for thousands of years before colonization, had stewarded that land and had, shaped that land so that it could be a productive ecology for the people who are living on it for literally thousands of years. In the short, 300 years that colonizers have lived here, we've completely destroyed that, and the knowledge around keeping those lands is still being trying to be stamped out, and it doesn't make sense because that type of knowledge is critical for us to move forward. So yeah, I'm a huge fan of Julia Watson's work. Like, I think it's so critical for us to see that as future technology, future knowledge.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, we don't want to lose that wisdom. And you mentioned diapers. I mean, definitely they're some of the worst in terms of recycling. They're very difficult. I see a lot of those sadly in the ocean when I'm surfing in the mornings. It's disgusting. And from diapers moving into human waste, i.e. shit, which you've covered extensively. It's funny because I was reading a book recently on closed loop systems and architecture, and it sort of shows the study, the circular systems of these types of buildings or kind of systems that they're making. And sort of human waste is a critical component in making energy and kind of going back into the system. What have you discovered in your research and your work in human waste, and why is it so important?
Well, I would say that human waste is food, right? Like, it's just the other end of it. And we like to just flush it down the toilet, but it's actually knowledge. Like, we could learn so much if we understood our human waste. And I think that that's actually a very cultural thing. I've spoken to lots of kind of immigrant first generation kids like myself who have moms who are always like, when you're sick, well, did you poop? Like, what did it look like? Tell us all about it. And I think that kind of understanding that things like feces are going to tell you a lot about your body and what your body needs and how your body is performing, that's knowledge that we're literally flushing down the toilet. Beyond human waste, like animal waste, other kinds of waste, those are things that, again, we have to live with. Not just around closed loop systems, but regenerative systems. Like, we need animal waste. We need animal management to create productive, biodiverse agricultural systems. And so these things are all about things in balance. And so I don't know that much about human waste, but I do know for centuries, thousands of years, people have used their own waste as a way of replenishing the soil. And it's incredible that soil is this living, complex, fragile system that can actually manage all of those things. And so I don't know what the system should be, but I do think that, again, us having a different relationship with everything that we call waste is a critical step in thinking about how to build regenerative systems, both in urban spaces, but also in non-urban spaces.
Yeah, it's interesting. The garden that we have, we're using a lot of sort of chicken poop and that type of thing. And I've sort of wondered what could be done with the human waste. So it's something I might look into and see how I can utilize it in my garden. And for sure. And also with feces as well. And you talk about regeneration and rebirth and these types of things within nature. What have you worked much with fungi or looked into much of how fungi could play an important part in the future of food?
Absolutely. It's interesting. I have some books that I have here. John Cage's Mycological Foray. I'm really interested in fungi. I mean, fungi is nature's kind of cleanup crew. Fungi are part of the foundational pieces of how we can create these kind of ecological systems where waste is not considered waste anymore. We need fungi and a diverse microbiome within the soil to actually break down organic materials into their kind of fundamental parts that can then be used for growing plants, for feeding trees, for feeding other types of living and non-living things. So I do think fungi are absolutely foundational to it. I mean, the largest living organism is a giant fungus. And so it's really interesting because the world of fungi is something that we are only now beginning to understand. I have, see here, I have Paul Stamets' book, Mycelium Running, back here somewhere.
It's funny, I've got one just here as well. Paul Stamets, thank
right.
you for your work, Paul. We all love you.
Yeah, mine is up there. You can't see it. Yeah, I saw Paul Stamets do a talk at the New School here in New York, and he just like unlocked something in my brain. Like I had no idea that this world existed, and his, whatever, his 30 minutes, 45-minute talk, it just opened a door, and I was like, wow, here is this entire world that I have no idea about, but is also part of the ancestral knowledge that I am from, the lineage that I am from. I'm Chinese American, but my ancestors have lived and understood that the power of mushrooms is one that's really reciprocal and is critical to human health. And so it's something that I have been really trying to learn more about, as I get older.
Yeah, it's a fascinating subject. It's something I'm really studying as well.
Yeah, we can learn so much.
Yeah, moving on to diet and sort of plants or food as nutrition. We're seeing a lot of people now moving towards a plant-based diet. How do you think, obviously we know that that's nutritional for our bodies, and on a level of environmentalism or kind of like moving into a more sustainable future, could eating meat or dairy, could that be sustainable? Because I know meat has a bit of a bad rep at the moment, or it's increasingly getting a bad rep, understandably, with industrial agriculture and some of the really bad practices that we're doing. But there is obviously still people farming sustainably, and they're sort of getting a bad rep in certain circles as well. Have you looked into that much in terms of like eating meat, future populations? Could that be done in a sustainable manner?
Yeah, I think everything in moderation should be sustainable, but not just sustainable, because I think we're at a crisis point that we really, as a species, need to move beyond sustainable. It's not about, because even just sustaining where we're at right now is not getting us anywhere. It's actually, we're still on a death spiral. But we need to think about regenerative systems, like what, again, indigenous knowledge is, indigenous knowledge, like how do we understand that there is a more complex relationship with the environment around us that can be regenerative, that we can actually create systems that put more into the soil, the ground, than we are extracting. And so I believe that animals are critical to that system. I think that if you kind of follow along any sort of small to medium scale farmer that is farming in a with a biodiverse, low input way, they will tell you that you absolutely need animals to be part of that system for it to remain in balance. So I think that looking beyond kind of American expectations around eating meat, for example, or European expectations around eating meat, there are plenty of cultures all over the world that consume meat, dairy in a very responsible way, where it's something that is about a flavor, about a texture that can't be, brought in by plant-based things, but it's not a steak on a plate. It's about something else. And I think that embracing those types of multicultural, other cultured approaches to deliciousness, to flavor, is going to be critical for thinking about the future of food. I don't believe that telling other people what they can and cannot eat will get us anywhere. I believe that it's really about moving the culture to a place that really looks at deliciousness as a kind of driving factor in how we eat in the future. I don't, I eat a steak every once in a while. I love a hamburger, I'm not gonna lie. And when I do eat those things, I try to eat and source them in the most responsible way possible. I don't need to eat a steak every day. I probably eat a steak once every couple months, but when I do, I'll spend a lot of money on it because I'm like, I'm eating a steak today. This is what I want to eat. And I'm lucky and privileged enough that I can do that. But I do think that, there's plenty of examples of farmers who are looking at different ways of managing the land with animals like cows. I think what you mentioned, which is we get into problems when we're, raising animals for slaughter in this kind of industrial way. I mean, I think what we've learned in the last 70 years is that trying to shape any sort of food system through an industrial lens, doesn't make sense. It doesn't do anyone any good. It's not nutritious. It is just extremely extractive. It affects everything around us, from the air we breathe to the water that we drink. It's not a way to move forward. And I think farmers that are even in that system know that. And it's politics, it's money, it's things like this that are really preventing a lot of people from looking towards different systems that make sense for both the farmer and the consumers that are part of that cycle.
Yeah, it's just breaking those systems. I mean, a lot of them, they're relatively new systems, and they were born, I believe, right after the war. A lot of these things kind of came to fruition, and people knew at the time this isn't necessarily good, but for some reason it stuck and it became quite profitable. So it's how do we unwind that and get back to a locavore diet and being proud of working with local farmers and that type of thing. So yeah, as you mentioned, politics, how do you break through that, especially with a leader like Trump? How do you manage to sort of overcome this? It's a big question.
It's a huge political question, and one of the reasons why industrial agriculture found footing globally is because for a lot of countries, post-war countries, part of their packages their aid packages for reconstruction were predicated on adopting certain kind of agricultural practices, buying certain amount of fertilizer. Japan is a great example of that. And so, these systems are exported, and it's hard, once the soil is degraded to this point where we're at now, creating systems that are then feeding the soil in a way that would be regenerative. That's a long-term commitment that not everybody is willing to make. I don't have that many answers. I don't know really much about agricultural policy, even in the United States, but I do believe in the power of the people, and I do believe that designers have a special role to play in empowering people to be creative collaborators within the food system.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I know very little, generally about food, even though I work in hospitality, I know very little about the systems. I'm kind of learning about it. And I think the work that you're doing is so important, to myself and people around me, the fact that, you can look at things differently and get back to nature, and using design and what I do, design and creativity, to actually change things. So I think it's definitely an important conversation that we're having. And as you mentioned, I think the more people that get on board, the more power we have, and then we can try to make some positive changes. And I think hopefully this pandemic may well bring about that. Let's see. Just moving into the multi-sensorial aspect of food that you talk about so often, what is that exactly, just for people that maybe haven't read the magazine?
Well, it's interesting because one of the things I learned early in this research is that kind of eating food is one of the few things that we do as humans that engages all of our senses. The other thing we do is have sex. And so clearly, eating and the sensorial aspect is very fundamental to who we are as people. So when people ask about the future of food, people are interested in pills or nutritional shakes or whatever. And for me, my argument is that if we're really going to talk about the future of food, we need to talk about how eating makes us human, and how eating is pleasure, how it's desire, how it's joy, how it's sharing. And so that's why the last issue of the magazine was about designing for the multisensory kind of world. And I think that that's something that we have to always remember when we think about the future of food. We have to also remember that even ideas around deliciousness are highly tied to different types of sensorial experiences depending on culturally where you're from. So for example, being Chinese American, much of Chinese cuisine, or the cuisine that I grew up with, is about texture. So there's lots of different words to describe the texture of food. Whereas in English, there's not as much of a kind of culinary vocabulary that focuses on texture. I think when, for example, the kind of French culinary history is kind of the benchmark of fine dining in the United States and in much of Europe, you lose a lot of the kind of nuances that come with having a more inclusive, global, broad understanding of what food can be.
Yeah, I always remember some of my early trips to Japan when I was younger, and obviously it's a vastly different landscape to coming from the UK. And they would just sort of take pleasure in sort of making you taste certain things and see if you could handle it, and it was just such a different, just the two complete different ends of the spectrum. And if you could sort of pass the test and eat the craziest stuff, then you'd sort of get the respect from the Japanese at the table. Some fun trips. And what's quite common here in Indonesia, and I guess a lot of other countries, is eating with hands. So obviously we do it a little bit in the Western world, maybe with chicken wings or things like that, but it's generally frowned upon if you're eating with your hands. Especially when I grew up in England, it was kind of rude to eat with your hands. You're always sort of taught not to eat with your hands. And in Indonesia here, it's a very sort of day-to-day practice. And I feel there is definitely a much deeper connection of when you're eating with your hands. And you see a lot of people here with water and almost giving a level of gratitude with water. And again, it's that connection. I know you mentioned a bit of that in the magazine. Do you think that's something what do you think it is about eating with hands that sort of, does that add to the sensorial aspect, or do you think there's something deeper there?
Well, it's a lot of things, and again, it's cultural, right? It's kind of about culturally what is being, what you're growing up with. So for one thing, there's for example, in cultures like in Korea, there's actually a word around the taste of something that's handmade. So it's about the taste of the hand. And so there's something quite special about feeding yourself with your hand. What we've learned more recently with the research of somebody like Dr. Charles Spence, who is British, is that in fact, cultures that eat with their hands actually have a much better kind of understanding of there's just a much better relationship with portion control. So there's something, for example, in Chinese culinary kind of tradition, we have a bowl that we pick up. There's usually rice in it, and then you use a chopstick to kind of shovel the rice or the food into your mouth. But even just the weight of the bowl in the hand helps with portion control. And so for those cultures that are eating with hands, drinking with hands, there's something about the kind of sensorial delight of being able to participate in your food in this way that we're only now beginning to understand from a maybe scientific perspective. But I think as humans, we've always understood the pleasure of eating with your hand, the ability to take the temperature of it, to understand the weight of it, the mass, the textures, all of those things are so critical for our kind of understanding of pleasure and food. And I think that that's something that, again, that we're returning to is food should be pleasurable. It should be delicious. It's not we don't want food to be something that we have this kind of punitive relationship with. We want it to be always joyful.
Absolutely. That's very interesting. So LinYee, it's been fascinating chatting to you. Thank you so much. Just on a final note, any words of wisdom for the youth of today or young designers who are coming through that want to build a better future? Could you give us a few words of wisdom?
I think all designers, all young people right now are really interested in building a better future. And it's incredible because we are in a moment of crisis that really demands this kind of imagining, this kind of participation for architecting multiple kinds of futures. And so I would say for those who are designers who are interested in building better food futures, to remember that, yes, pleasure should always be part of that. But how do we build pleasurable, delicious food ecologies that benefit us as creative consumers, but also the non-human collaborators that we always have been working with to actually create these nutritious, delicious, and things to eat. And I think that that's something that I would love to hear more ideas around.
Amazing. LinYee, thank you so much. Keep up your fantastic work. I'm personally learning so much, so yeah, keep it up. And it's been so good to have you on the show. Appreciate it. And we'll catch up soon.
Thanks, Dan.
Thank you so much.
Have a great night.
Thank you. Cheers.
Bye.
Bye-bye.